Hello, my name is David Nolan, and I'm the host of Actuary Voices, the podcast from the American Academy of Actuaries. Today, I'm talking to Craig Chu, the president of the Sexuality and Gender Alliance of Actuaries. Craig, welcome to Actuary Voices.
Thanks for having me.
I like to ask people about themselves and how they became an actuary, because obviously it's a little bit of a niche profession.
Sure. My upbringing was a pretty standard suburban upbringing in Arlington, Texas, where, the standard, I think, American childhood in the suburb, driving to school. After high school, I graduated and I went to California for college, where I was a math major, just because math was always the thing that I loved and loved and loved. And I think, like a lot of us, I realized as a math major, if I really wanted to stick with something that focused on math, my options these days, 20 years ago, were mostly academia or becoming an actuary or becoming a teacher. And, not that I didn't love all of my friends who were going into academia and I didn't like the idea of being a teacher, but I decided to, choose the actuary path.
Sounds interesting. So when did you first realize that you were good at math? Was there a spark, or was it just always there?
It was certainly one of those things as a kid that was always the fun class. It was always the thing where I was in honors classes. I still remember in algebra, which in the honors path was in 8th grade, we were learning, I believe it was back when we were solving quadratic equations. There was a method to solve a quadratic equation called completing the square, and the math nerds listening are going to know what I'm talking about. I still remember we were learning this method, and I was thinking to myself, well, this is all fine and dandy, but why am I doing this process every time? Instead of using numbers, shouldn't I just put an A, B, and C in there and see what comes out and then just use that every time? And then I didn't even realize it until getting to class the next day, but I had basically derived the quadratic formula for myself in 8th grade. Because I basically said, well, here's this thing that I'm doing over and over again. Maybe I should just try generalizing it myself. And then the next day I walked in and the teacher said, so we're going to learn this formula that's a general solution from completing the square. And I said, oh. And it was kind of the spark in my mind. I was like, well, in 8th grade, I sort of proved the quadratic formula for myself. But it was that sort of moment where I said, no, I really like figuring out how things work. I like the inherent elegance in math. When things work out just the way you want them to, it's really, really great.
Yeah, that's true. And when you went to college, did you actually do any actuarial science, or was it a pure math degree? And who led you towards the actuarial profession? Was it something the university promoted?
No. So I attended Caltech, which has a very, very strong focus on academic training and academia. So there wasn't any sort of actuarial science specialty. I didn't even realize till after I graduated that there were other people in my class who ended up becoming actuaries. So I essentially knew that I enjoyed math. I changed from pure mathematics to applied mathematics fairly early on when I didn't quite love proofs as much as I liked solving problems. And it was something about that solving problems that I, just did a little bit of Googling myself and realized that being an actuary was something that I'd probably enjoy.
Yeah, both my kids did a philosophy of math course in high school, and they loved that a lot more than the pure math part of it.
Interesting.
So you started your actuarial exams post-college?
I did end up starting junior year. I believe this was back in the days when they were only offered twice a year. So there were 2 sittings. There was a May sitting and a November sitting. And so I had gone through 3 sittings by the time I graduated college. So there was 1 exam in the May sitting of my junior year, and then a pair of exams during my senior year. So I did end up graduating with 3 exams, which 20 years ago was pretty rare. But I did know that if I was going to pursue this was something I just wanted to blast through, because I don't like having tasks hanging over my head.
Yes, you're absolutely right. 20 years ago, that may have been rare, but we give a scholarship at Drake University Actuarial Conference when it happens every year. And it was interesting. I was working with some of the actuaries who were judging the entrance, and they put a lot of stake in the number of exams the applicants had passed. And some of them have got 4. So yeah, the standards, I think, have clearly evolved and become more challenging over the years.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So tell us about your current role then. What field are you in and how do you find it?
So I am the deputy actuary at the New York State and Local Retirement System. So I am a pension actuary by trade. I've got about 20 years of experience as a pension actuary. Since 2017 or so, I have been working in-house in the public sector, which has been pretty rewarding, hopefully for some obvious reasons, but we may get into those a little bit more later. And it's been great. It's been a nice balance where I can feel like I'm giving back.
Well, you said you'd like to talk a little bit about some of the things you find particularly rewarding. Should we start there?
obviously, I think everyone knows that in general, actuaries are pretty well compensated. So that is obviously a nice perk of the profession. But, aside from that, my boss has a story where when he was starting out, he started out at a very large insurance company. And the same year that the company said that they didn't have enough profit to offer staff bonuses was a year that the CEO took home an 8-figure bonus for himself. And, that's not true across the board, but that can be true in certain spaces. And it's generally not true in the public sector. Public sector pensions in particular, there are media sources out there who can pick outliers. We all know, I think most of us who follow a reasonable amount of media know how easy it is to cast stones. But for the most part, the vast majority of public pensions are reasonably and responsibly funded. And I was even looking just before this recording, our average retiree benefit is less than $30,000 a year. So for all of the anecdotal evidence that biased media likes to point to say, look at these fat cats sitting there. If you pick one person out of 600,000, you're going to be able to find a couple of things that make the whole bushel look bad. But I mean, we're talking about a vast number of retirees who are just making ends meet, and having these public pension systems is what's allowing them to do that. And so by being a part of the responsible funding of those pension systems, I get to feel like I'm using my talents to do something good that's actually helping people who have given their careers to public service to actually have a secure retirement.
Sure, and that's very reassuring to hear, because you're right. You do hear these outlying stories and they can be eye-opening or jaw-dropping, but unless you actually take them in context, as you know, it is absurd to focus on those ones. And clearly, many people enter public service for a lot of very good reasons, but one of them is that in retirement, they will be looked after. That's an important thing that people consider when they're figuring out what role they want to play in their lives. There are some challenges to specifically some public pension plans. Do you want to talk a little bit about those as well?
Sure. It's tricky because of the obvious outsized attention that they get in the media. And, I'm not saying it's not warranted, and some of the criticism can be even-handed and fair. Much of it isn't. But public pensions generally are very well funded. But you have an interesting situation where many elected officials have 4-year terms in this country, sometimes shorter, sometimes longer, especially small municipalities. You may be talking about a municipality with 10 employees and one elected official who's gone in a few years. And I think most actuaries know our focus is on long-term sustainable funding. And so those things can be at odds in a very, very dangerous way. And so essentially, unscrupulous people can realize that sometimes if they want to make a couple irresponsible decisions for a few years, they'll be long gone by the time that they have to pay the piper. By the time the municipality realizes they're in trouble, the elected official who precipitated it has been out of office for 20 years. Voters, through no fault of their own, don't understand 20-year funding horizons. And so very often, sabotage is a bit of a strong word. I wish there were a slightly weaker word than sabotaged by certain unscrupulous actors. There was one fund I can think of that was actually in pretty reasonable shape until the chief executive of a state just decided not to make the actuarial contributions for the time that they were in office. And so by the time that the pension system is in a funding crisis, it's 10 years down the line. And while that politician was in office, he had 4 years of additional funds where he could say, look at all of these great things I'm doing for you, the taxpayers. And so there's a lot of conflicting actors there that it's important to be aware of, and it's important to balance. It's never an easy question.
Sure. And you don't necessarily have to be unscrupulous for things to go wrong, because sometimes the law of unintended consequences kicks in, and something that looks like a good idea on one hand ends up having ramifications down the road on other things.
Certainly.
So public pension plans, people obviously know they exist, but many people may not realize what role the actuary plays in keeping them going. Do you want to say a few words about, I don't want to call it your day-to-day, but I just did, so let's call it about your day-to-day.
Sure. For anyone listening who doesn't really understand public pensions or pensions in general, we're talking about funding a lifetime promise for somebody who has worked for 30 years so that they can get a specified benefit for the rest of their lives. But what that requires is the long time horizon and the analysis to know that over those 30 years, you've got to be putting money away. And so you extrapolate this to maybe thousands of people, maybe hundreds of thousands of people. And so actuaries play a role in looking at the demographics of those people, projecting the costs and then figuring out how to spread those costs responsibly over the funding horizon that they choose. To some extent, even choosing the funding horizon is a matter of actuarial judgment. So there's a tremendous amount of actuarial judgment that goes into figuring out how we want to be sure that these things are going to be there for posterity. And all of the pension actuaries I know are interested in making sure that these funds are there for posterity. Sometimes we have arguments about the right assumptions and the right ways to do it, and arguments can sometimes even be putting it lightly. But all of the public pension actuaries that I know love well-funded and rigorously funded pension systems.
Well, you're here today, as I mentioned at the beginning, because you're the president of the Sexuality and Gender Alliance of Actuaries. Why don't you tell us a little bit about SAGAA, as it is known, and maybe its history, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, happy to. So SAGAA, the Sexuality and Gender Alliance of Actuaries, as you were mentioning, was founded in 2020, so we're a fairly young organization, by a couple of gentlemen by the names of Jake and Matt, who are still in contact with us. We still have great relationships with them. But being fairly new actuaries, they were looking for a safe space and for community. And that's really something that I think a lot of LGBTQ folks and queer folks in general, they can really resonate with that idea, because outside of large major cities in the United States, a lot of times people under that queer umbrella really want to feel like they have a safe space. And so SAGAA was founded with the idea of fostering connection and providing that safe space for LGBT actuaries across the spectrum and across the country.
So yes, as you say, it's a new organization. You seem to have achieved quite a bit in your time during existence.
Yeah, so the organization, by nature of having started in 2020, the initial function of the organization was a lot of virtual happy hours, which is a lot of what I think all of us were doing in 2020. And over the course of the last few years, we have been really taking a look at the role that LGBT actuaries and allies can play in general. And so our mission statement says something along the lines of wanting to provide community and a safe space for LGBTQ actuaries, as well as educating, informing, and advocating on issues that can affect LGBTQ individuals. Just for example, a couple years ago, we were taking a look and realizing HIV and AIDS is an issue that disproportionately affects gay men. And in a lot of states in the United States, people living with HIV and AIDS cannot buy life insurance, just for example. There is finally a renewed emphasis on transgender and gender nonconforming individuals. We're witnessing a little bit of reactionary times politically against that, but most people are finally acknowledging that transgender and gender non-binary people exist, which may lead to a lot of insurance questions in terms of insurance rating. So those are things that we want to be equipped to handle, and we want to be a resource as organizations want to look into these things, to have the footprint where people can advise and understand and inform on those issues as well.
And how do you go about doing that?
So our year right now has been a year of really taking stock and reestablishing our committee structure so that we can be sure we have a research committee. It's a resource building year, I like to call it. And we're heavily focused on infrastructure and making sure that with our limited footprint, we're going to be able to have an impact in the future. We've been in touch with a couple organizations doing research. We've had a couple of calls with the folks at the Society of Actuaries, just being sure that we're on their radar as LGBT topics arise. We're still figuring out, I think, at this point, how we want that role to shape up.
Yeah, and we've had a couple of calls with some of your board members about these issues as well, because the Academy's got a robust research committee, and there were some ideas tossed around.
Right.
I fully understand and support the importance of infrastructure and creating a foundation for future work. And do you have a sense of when you get through this phase of what you'd like to do?
We would certainly like to be able to advocate more for LGBT individuals. I think a lot of actuaries are familiar with the risk chart where you're talking about your known knowns and your unknown knowns and your known unknowns. A little bit of LGBT research by its very nature falls into the quadrant of what people call unknown unknowns. We want to be ready for when those unknown unknowns become known unknowns, so that we can step in and offer our expertise in places where we might be able to contribute.
Let me take a moment to remind listeners that you're listening to Actuary Voices, the podcast from the American Academy of Actuaries, which is celebrating its 60th anniversary this year. On this podcast, we talk to Academy volunteers and leaders, as well as friends of the Academy, about what inspires them about their work, both professionally or as a friend of or volunteer with the Academy. Please subscribe to Actuary Voices on your preferred podcast platform. Now, back to my conversation with Craig Chew. And if there was one thing you wanted people to take away from this conversation to know about SAGAA, or if you have a call to action for people, what might that be?
I think SAGAA's roots of fostering community are actually among the most important. It's very easy as somebody living and working in New York City, and I presume, David, that you're based in Washington, D.C. It's very easy sometimes to forget that the experience of those of us living in New York and Washington is not the experience of those living elsewhere. The actuarial profession actually has a very large footprint in the Midwest, and so we have had a lot of people reach out to SAGAA and say, I'm glad you exist because I am not only the only gay actuary I know, I'm the only LGBT person that is out in my immediate circle. And so a lot of times folks will join us. We had a virtual happy hour just last night where in our debrief at the end, it turned out that somebody was actually joining us from the Philippines. And they were so excited that while they were going through this process, they could at least know that other LGBT actuaries existed. And, maybe in large cities in the Philippines, there might be reasonable LGBT and queer scenes, but this was a person taking a couple of exams saying, I'm really, really glad that even your existence and your visibility is helping me to know that this is a career I could pursue. And that was a really rewarding thing to hear. And it's really reinvigorating us, I think, to be sure that we're not losing track of that community building aspect.
Right. And it's a sign of your impact that somebody from the Philippines found out about it. The fact that they took the time to join, it's obviously huge. But finding out about it in the first place might well have been a challenge.
Right. In our attendee list on LinkedIn, I think somebody had said that they were a maybe for attendance who is actually based in Brazil. So I was looking forward to see if they would be able to attend, but they weren't able to make it last night.
Okay. Here's to many more happy hours in person as well. And if you would like to host an event in DC, I know the Academy would be more than happy to help you put that on.
Oh, fantastic. Thanks.
I'd like now to return a little bit to the actuarial profession writ large. Obviously, it's a time of constant flux, but I'm wondering, are there any specific challenges or opportunities you'd like to highlight that you think create some openings for the profession, or where the door might be closing?
It's an interesting question. Obviously, the hot topic on everyone's minds right now is AI. I think that could have gone without saying. I personally take a little bit of a more measured approach to AI than I think some other folks do, because what we've seen so far is essentially a language model. And when I talk to other actuaries about AI, everybody's response is, yeah, it can write certain things very quickly, but man, it turns out to be surprisingly bad at math. And then we all chuckle because I'm usually talking with actuaries, but it's easy to forget that just because it's a computer and it's electronic, it's designed to sound natural. So it will say something like, oh, of course, that's 10% of 60,000, so it's $6. And it will say it very confidently, like it's writing a report. And so if it doesn't even have the function of a very strong calculator, then I don't necessarily know or think that it's the existential risk to the actuarial profession that some folks are, at least at this point, that a lot of folks are sounding the alarm bells about. The actuarial profession is interesting. As a pension actuary for the last 20 years, I have witnessed some pretty tremendous changes just in the space for pension actuaries. I think folks in the pension space know that. And those of us fortunate enough to know folks from the pre-ERISA days will really know and understand the massive, massive realignment that pensions have had. But that being said, one of the features of the actuarial profession is its long-sighted nature of everything. And occasionally that can be a con when you really need to be agile and move quickly for something. But for the most part, it's a pro because in my mind, there is this stability in finding people who have the determination to pass a grueling set of exams, filtering through a professional career where people are able to do strong analysis, numerical analysis at that, and then boil it down for stakeholders who are very often not technically minded. And so as long as those things are still true, I do think actuaries are going to have a space for us. I don't foresee any existential crises for the actual profession writ large.
That's good to hear. And your point about boiling down complicated topics for regular people is very well made. When I joined the Academy 10 plus years ago, I knew that actuaries had a reputation for being uncommunicative, let's say. And when I got here, I was blown away at how communicative they were and how good they were at explaining to me. I've done a little bit of math. I knew that $6 was not 10% of 60,000, but it was mind-blowing how good they were about explaining these very, very complicated topics. That is a vital skill, because if you can't explain it to people, then they're not really taking on board either the warnings or the opportunities you're talking about.
That's really good to hear that was your experience. And it's something that, now that you brought it up, I think is worth staying on for a little bit, because if there are early to mid-career actuaries listening to this podcast, I do want to offer the advice that, being the guy who was always great at math and attended Caltech and, originally wanted to be a math professor before deciding to become an actuary, it took a few years of professional experience before I really understood how important that skill was, of boiling down the insanely complicated math for your audience. And past a certain point of competency and past a certain point in one's career, I dare say it almost becomes more important than the ability to do the most complex topics yourself. I should elaborate when I say more important. But if you imagine a large multinational corporation, the CEO running that corporation does not know how to do the programming tasks that they are assigning to IT. And so take the analogy of that for actuarial work. Any organization where you don't have actuaries in charge, and some organizations do have actuaries in charge, but at any organization where actuaries are not in charge, actuaries are going to be reporting to non-actuaries. And so, imagine the CEO in the example I just offered is asking IT a question, and IT starts talking about, how they've initialized certain variables to have extra dimensions and certain variables to have more space for memory. And they don't care about that. And so, I have seen plenty of entry-level and mid-career actuaries, when asked a question by a non-technical person, start talking about these assumptions and all of these things that happened in the spreadsheet and how the data had to be adjusted for this and that, when, those are things that aren't going to matter to the person that they're explaining things to. So it's a really, really important skill, and it can't be overstated how important that is and how much more it can affect our careers than some early career actuaries realize. So thanks for bringing that up, and thanks for letting me get on my soapbox for a little about it.
Oh, no, I'm happy to have you on your soapbox. And it's interesting to note that the actuarial standard of practice on actuarial communication is one of the most opened and read on the Actuarial Standards Board's website. And it's one that an awful lot of people talk about when they're talking about the standards in general, when they're doing presentations. They do focus on that one a lot.
Yeah, and that's for good reason. And, back when I was entry level, one of my first bosses, who has since retired but still volunteers with the actuarial profession, one of the best pieces of advice she gave me is, sometimes these standards change, they'll wordsmith things for good reason, but the absolute most important one is that your documentation needs to be sufficient so that another qualified actuary in your practice area could read it and feel comfortable with what you did. And then if your report is going to non-actuaries, there should be some kind of summary at the front that they can understand, with a little note that says more information in the back. And then the back is where you put that stuff that other actuaries should be able to follow. And it really stuck out to me, because it's the way we should always strive to communicate. All of us technically minded folks should always strive so that anybody else who's technically minded knows what we're talking about and is comfortable with it. But people who are not as technically minded or don't have the same background can still understand us.
Right. Yep. Those very good words. Craig, I like to ask people what they do for fun. What are your hobbies?
Oh, living in New York City has been really, really great for the fact that I love to eat. And to top it all off, I live in Queens. So I like nothing more than wandering the streets, finding a restaurant where it looks like I'll be welcome, but they may not speak much English, having a seat with a smile and starting to point at things that I don't quite know. Once in a while it backfires, but for the most part, I get some pretty great experiences out of it. Not even in Queens. I have a great story. There was one time my husband had to cluck like a chicken in a restaurant. We were overseas in a restaurant where the owners had clearly paid to have an English translation of their menu, but nobody spoke any English. And so one dish that definitely said in parentheses, choice of chicken or pork or beef, we sort of pointed at it. I believe it was Cambodian. And then, not really knowing how to indicate what we wanted, I just sort of pointed at it and then clucked like a chicken, and then pointed at another dish and went and what we wanted arrived. So it's been great.
Yeah, one of my favorite cooking shows was Anthony Bourdain, and I love eating street food whenever I travel. Just, as you say, sometimes it backfires.
Street food, I think our rule of thumb, and we do try to travel quite a bit, our rule of thumb is the street food is great to try. Maybe don't try it within 48 hours of your flight home.
Good rule to have. Craig, we're coming to the end of our time together. Is there anything else you'd like to raise?
It's been a really great conversation, David. Thanks for having me. I think my parting note should just be that anybody interested in the work that SAGAA is doing or who otherwise wants to be in touch should head to sagaactuaries.org. It's SAGAA Actuaries, 2 A's in the middle there. There's a web form to sign up for our mailing list. And if you email info@sagaactuaries.org, that will get to someone on the board who will be in touch with whatever your inquiry might be.
Craig, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks much for having me.
Today, I was speaking with Craig Chu, the president of the Sexuality and Gender Alliance of Actuaries. My name is David Nolan, and I'm the host of Actuary Voices, the podcast from the American Academy of Actuaries, which is celebrating its 60th anniversary this year. Please visit our website, actuary.org, for a wealth of information about the work that the Academy does. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And of course, please subscribe to this podcast on your preferred podcast platform.